pain, vulnerability, and the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Today on Spirit Inspire, we talk about the reality of evil and suffering and the mercy and redemption of Christ, starting right now. Broadcasting from the Cathedral of the Assumption in Louisville, Kentucky, this is Spirit Inspire. And now, here is your host. Hello and welcome to another episode of Spirit Inspire. I'm your host for today, Isaac Fox, joined as always with Mr. John Soul over here.
Hello, everyone.
And Vince Ricketts.
Howdy.
Vince is frequently behind the scenes doing the cameras and interjecting. He's joining us at the table today for this very important conversation. So guys, I know we're going to talk today a little bit about a topic that is maybe not super pleasant in the way it sounds, but really important and impacts all of our lives. Namely the problem of suffering, of evil, of pain. And just a couple of thoughts I wanted to share here right at the beginning is, first of all, that suffering is something which impacts all of our lives. It's got to be one of the most common universal human experiences. And that commonality kind of leads to two problems. One problem is attempting to understand suffering or evil at all, like why it's here, why it happens. And we all are familiar with the fact that this has led to some really big questions in the history of theology, like how could a good God allow suffering, for example, right? These are very important questions. And these are things that we often attempt to address intellectually, to look at through various arguments, maybe sort of philosophical arguments, to demonstrate how God's goodness and the existence of suffering are not incompatible. But then at another level, perhaps a deeper level in a sense, there is this very existential reality that each of us go through suffering, and sometimes we can't find a reason for it.
Yeah.
Or at least not an obvious reason. I would just kind of share from my own experience. I'm aware that God can use the bad things that happen to us and turn them to good in our life. So I think that when I experience some suffering, I'm always kind of trying to figure out what that is. Like, what's the reason for this? Is this a lesson, right? Is it an opportunity for me to grow in patience? Is it whatever? And sometimes the suffering just gets me and I can't make heads or tails of it. I get really frustrated because I want to find that answer, you know? And so I think there is this kind of existential level in which it's not that the philosophical answers aren't true. They are. But it's that we can't see the solution to our particular situation here and now that we're undergoing. And so maybe the intellectual answers don't suffice to assist somebody who is in a period of great suffering.
Oh, gosh. Usually somebody will, you try to intellectualize it to someone who's actually suffering. They're just going to look at you and say, shut up. Yeah. Like you have no idea what you're talking about.
Great argument. I hurt right now.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
So I think maybe today...
it's not a compassionate thing
approach
to do.
Right.
It's as a matter of fact, compassion, compassio, to suffer with.
With suffering, yeah.
Right. That's why the Passion of the Christ is called his passion, because it's his suffering. So, there's this Christian mission that involves suffering along with people, but we'll get into that a little bit more.
Yeah. Which is more than just even being there for somebody.
Right.
It's actually that entering into the midst of their suffering. So we're kind of thinking today, and for anybody listening, we're going to try to divide this up into a couple of sections today. Mm-hmm. So in the first part, we're going to look a little bit at those more sort of intellectual answers. And I think that's a good place to start because we even need to begin by defining what is evil, what is good, what do these things even mean? And we'll probably keep that to a shorter section here at the beginning, and then we'll try to look into these realities of suffering in our life, the suffering Christ experienced on the cross, what that means to us, how it helps us make sense of our suffering, and all the rest of that. So
let's do it.
Sound good?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and one more kind of housekeeping comment. As always, make sure to like this video if you like it. If you don't like it, leave a comment.
Anyway. No.
Well, or do that.
Leave
a comment and tell us how much you hate it. Yeah. And also, if you know,
in polite terms, right?
Right, absolutely.
Increase our suffering a little bit.
What's the great line from from Robin Hood Men in Tights. Tell me the bad news in a good way.
So, and finally, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, gosh, I know somebody who needs to hear this, then share it. That's a good practical way to help somebody else, and it also helps us kind of reach a broader audience. If that be the will of God, that's something we like to do.
Yeah, if there's a section even of the video that you really, really particularly loved that you think, oh my gosh, just cut that out and I want to send that to people, let us know. Give us timestamps. We'll do that. That'd be a great thing because we're
trying to do a lot more of those.
Into
kind of cut out
clips.
those short clips. So yeah, there's something great. Let us know, and
be great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent.
Well, so evil. I mean, we can use several different words here: evil, suffering, pain. But I think fundamentally, probably the real core here is the idea of evil. And I don't know that we can really understand evil without thinking about goodness. And so it classically in Catholic thinking, we say that evil is a deprivation of good. And that's kind of like the definition. So maybe we could start with that, kind of break that open a little bit. What does that mean? What do we mean by good? What's a deprivation of good? What is evil?
Well, when I think of good and evil, of course, I think of the Garden of Eden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the whole grasping at the fruit, meaning rejecting the gift of God, trying to take matters into our own hands, make ourselves like God, but without God, which is the fall in a nutshell. But what goodness is God. God is supreme goodness, sheer goodness. And it is all flowing from his goodness that creation even has being. It is in existence. And so it is good that we exist simply because God said, let there be light. And then at the end of each day, it is good. And it was not until after man was created, male and female, he created them, that he looked at all of creation and said, it is very good. In fact, the Hebrew, I believe, is a repetition of the same word, good, on a level that makes you realize that only because human beings have been given the capacity to have gratitude, self-awareness, logic, and the capacity to love that separates us from animals and plants and inanimate matter, that gives all of creation the ability to praise God too. But that is what goodness is, right? Our capacity to love, to be loved, and to prove that love of God and how we love others, right?
You said a couple of things there, John, that I think really hit some key points. One is that God is supreme goodness, and all things flow from him. God is also supreme being. And if we think kind of philosophically, the idea of the transcendentals, right? We have being, truth, and goodness, those three things. And we say those are all convertible, meaning they're kind of different ways of saying the same thing.
You said beauty, truth, and goodness?
Being, truth, and goodness.
I thought it was beauty, truth, and goodness. It was the three
Beauty's
transcendentals.
not actually one of the transcendentals. It's just being, truth, and goodness.
Really?
Yeah. And I would just say, since you brought that up, some people do argue about that a little bit. Technically and traditionally, it's not one of the transcendentals. But I think it depends on how we define beauty. The reason it's not in the transcendentals is because beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's a bit subjective. But I think there's a beauty to order, to truth itself. So maybe it depends on what we mean by beauty, if we could include it there.
Well, I actually heard that beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is in the responsibility of the beholder and in the essence of the divine creator and in the thing itself and its capacity to point us to the divine creator.
And that would be like truth and order and goodness.
Right. So you look at a sunset and it's beautiful objectively because it was first created by God, points us to God, but also gives life to humanity on a physical level.
And I think that's what I'm saying. That's beauty. If that's what we mean by beauty, then I think it could be included in the transcendentals. I think it's not typically because our idea of beauty is something I find pretty, something I find personally very appealing.
Yes, when you fall into the relativistic pattern of our culture. Yeah. But you have to retrieve these words and use them properly, but that's hard when people misinterpret things so easily.
But historically, the original idea of the transcendentals was being, truth, and goodness.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that I that I like the idea that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, because I'm a beekeeper, which makes me a beholder.
Oh.
And that means that I get to have control, which is
believe
really
that
what
just
I
happened.
want. Yeah. I really like to have control over things and have things my way. But hey, speaking of the Garden of Eden,
Yeah, sorry if I
Right.
seem a little waspish about all this.
isn't that... no, but in all seriousness, yeah, like evil happens when we decide that it's my way. It's how things are going to be my way over and against the desires of God.
And it becomes less beautiful, less good, less true,
Absolutely.
less real.
And that's
You want to
deprivation.
talk about being.
Yeah.
It's non-being that is so evil.
So what happens when they eat of that fruit, right? There's death. Initially, it's a spiritual death, and then later that translates into physical death. But immediately you do see this happening of a deprivation, something being lost. Mm-hmm. So if we think of goodness as convertible with being, in other words, the idea, as you were saying, John, everything God made, he said was good. The very act of being, like going from non-being, of nothingness, to being, well, that's good. Mm-hmm. And God is supreme, infinite being. God is also supremely good, right? So everything he made was good. Can't really help but be good from that standpoint alone.
Right.
So what is evil then? Well, we can't call it non-being either exactly, because then it's just nothing at all. Mm-hmm. But rather it is a deprivation of goods that we're supposed to have.
Yes.
And Thomas, in St. Thomas, one of his works, the De Malo, which is strictly about the questions related to evil. And it's long. I hope to read through it someday. Yeah, everybody knows he wrote the...
Thousands of pages.
of the Summa. He started writing, what, I want to say like around 30 or late 20s, died before 40. You realize the sheer number of volumes that he wrote is incredible. The others weren't all short. Like the De Malo itself is over 300 pages long, and that was just one of his little treatises. But he makes the point in there that we have to understand deprivation in one of two ways to see if it's an evil or not. There are deprivations which relate to our nature or don't. And he gives two examples. He says, for a man to not have wings is not an evil, because it's not in accordance with our nature to have wings. You could say we're deprived of wings, but that's not an evil. It's just we were never meant to have wings.
Correct.
Or he says like a rock that doesn't have some sort of ability to think or see or feel, that's a deprivation, but it's not a deprivation of its nature. So it's not an evil. It's fully living out its rock nature. The deprivation becomes an evil when it's supposed to be part of our nature and we're lacking it.
Like someone's missing an arm.
Right. The example he uses there is blindness in the eye. The eye is designed for sight. And blindness isn't really a thing. It's just the absence of being able to see. It's a deprivation of sight.
Right.
So he kind of, helps define that deprivation as the deprivation of something which we need or which we ought to have, something which is either part of our nature or which would perfect our nature, such as virtues or grace, right? That's kind of how he thinks of evil.
I think... Oh, go for it.
Well, I was just to kind of, and correct me, Isaac, if I'm wrong, but this is the way I've thought about it for a little while, just in terms of trying to, put it into layman's terms a little bit better, is that evil is just when things are not as they should be.
I think it's perfect.
Yeah.
It's absolutely perfect.
Yes.
So and we actually kind of know that intuitively in a lot of cases. So, if you're, if you have, okay, one example would be that maybe applies to a lot of people is divorce.
Right.
So, divorce is evil, well, for a number of reasons, but if you get right down to it, because it's not how things ought to be.
Right.
Because a married couple ought to stay married until death do them part.
Right.
And the children, whom they bring forth ought to have parents who stay together and love one another in the ways that St. Paul outlines in Ephesians 5.
Sure.
But when divorce occurs, that's like the antithesis of that. It's the opposite of that.
And it usually is because of a deprivation of what should have been in the marriage, the loving and honoring one another, communication, dealing with conflict. But when people don't communicate well or don't deal with conflict, resentment grows, miscommunication ensues, lying takes place, and then...
But the point is that a child does not need to be trained in Thomistic philosophy to understand
Correct.
that it's actually evil when their parents get divorced.
Yeah.
And they may not be able to articulate it in such and such a way because maybe it happened when they were very young or when they didn't, but the point is that we know these things intuitively, that when things are not as they should be, that is evil.
And this is where, and it's so critically important to understand that while we speak of this on an intellectual level and philosophical level to really break open the difference between good and evil and the relationship between them, that these are not just theories or concepts. These directly affect human life. Yes. You talk about divorce, the effect that divorce has on a person's ability to love God, to worship God, to care about God, to care about their family properly, to understand how to treat themselves, let alone others, that will have repercussions that last decades or centuries, depending on the severity of the abuse, right? Oftentimes when kids are wrapped up in this, neglect takes place just by nature because there's so much pain and anger and just absentness of the parents, one or both, that children will often be left at their homes for hours by themselves, after school because dad said he was going to be there and he didn't show up for 3 or 4 hours. They're in the middle of the move because the parents split and one's moving into an apartment, the other's getting a new house somewhere else and they haven't sold the other one. And that's where the kid still grew up and lives. And these are the kinds of wounds that will stay with a person for 40, 50, 60, 70 years if they don't get the proper help.
Especially the younger in life they occurred, the more that has that impact.
Yes. Real suffering. Oh.
I think I had only one or two more thoughts on this kind of first part, but I did want to just briefly say something about the second article of the De Malo that Thomas says, because I think this is very important and ties directly into this. Because he asks the question whether evil can be in good. And he goes say it's the only place it can be, right? Because evil would just not be a thing at all. And he uses the example of color to help explain this. In color, we would think of, at least in sort of Aristotelian philosophy, as sort of an accidental quality of a thing, right? So you've got a black pen right there. The color on the outside of that pen is black. But we don't really just see blackness floating around like a thing in itself, right? And that's a bit as how he's describing evil. It needs a real subject to adhere in. You don't just have evil floating around, right? And things which have real existence, because being is convertible with goodness, are good. Therefore, evil can only exist in good things. And something I've thought about over the years is think of the devil, because that's what we think of as the supreme example of evil. We sometimes say pure evil. Well, I don't know that it's really right to say pure evil there. The devil is a being, has an intellect, has a will, is a person.
And he's about as impure as you can get.
Right. Completely. Okay. So, but those things, because God made him originally, the fact that he has being.
Ontologically, he's good.
So having being is good, right? Having a will is good. The problem is he uses his being only for evil. His will is only directed towards evil. His intellect is only directed towards evil. Every thought is evil, right? But you cannot say, like in this most fundamental, the substance of the thing itself, that it's pure evil. Evil is existing in something which, by definition, should be good. Having a will is good. Having intellect is good. Having existence is good, right? So I think that these are really important things to kind of give us a foundation, the idea of evil being a deprivation, and the fact that it doesn't just exist randomly on its own. There has to be some reality for it to exist in.
I think the perfect example is the difference between light and darkness. And go back to the first day of creation, right?
Yeah.
Day 1, God separates the light from the darkness. And it's not even until day 4 that he fills it with the sun and the moon to give it form, right? So there's a poetic relationship between the days of creation. But if you stay on just the first day and you look at, okay, well, where was the light coming from if not the sun? Well, it was coming from God because God is pure light, right? And that's tracked in Revelation, that in the end of time there won't be a need for the sun because the kingdom of God itself will emanate the light we need,
the
right?
Lamb itself is the light of the
Exactly,
New
the
Jerusalem.
Lamb itself, himself. So we have the light at the beginning of creation that is fulfilled at the end, but he separates the light from the darkness, and the darkness suddenly only exists in relation to the light because the light was already
Because
there.
again,
right?
darkness is the absence of light. It's this idea of deprivation.
Exactly.
And thank you for saying that, because I've thought this before, that darkness and light is the most perfect example of understanding this.
Because evil is simply the absence of good.
Right. Some people will kind of push back on the Catholic idea here because it's important to understand this deprivation theory, to understand how we make sense of suffering, or say how there can be suffering if God is good. Because we say that God created everything, and God doesn't make evil, and God didn't make anything bad. So when we encounter this argument saying, but there's bad things in the world, therefore God can't be good or God can't exist, the response is to show that evil is not really a thing, it's a lack or deprivation. And sometimes people will kind of push back on this, say, well, man, it seems awfully real to me. We're not questioning the reality of it, because remember, it exists in real things. Evil can only inhere in something which is good.
Yes.
But I think the light and dark is a perfect example of this, because think of the sunlight that hits the earth during daytime. There is an ontological reality there. There are actual particles and waves of sunlight. But when night comes, it's not like there's something emanating dark waves.
Right. It's not...
There isn't anything there. In fact, the whole atmosphere didn't change in the slightest. We have this atmosphere that's the same. It just is what it is. And then there is the presence of light waves, which have an actual reality to them. They're substantial. But when they go away, we're back to darkness, right? So that's the absence of light. Light is very real. The darkness is just not light.
In fact, if you strike a match and you have the match up against a wall and you shine the flashlight on the match to create a shadow, the match stick in your hand holding it has a shadow, but the light of the flame does not. So it's not, and you don't want to say, well, that means that doesn't have existence if you don't have a shadow. We're not going Peter Pan here, okay? Which
Trying to find my shadow.
Strange tangent there. That is a very, very weird cartoon as an adult watching now, in especially today's culture. Just be forewarned. They have to have like they put a what do you call it? A disclaimer at the beginning. Anyway. But the lack of light that we have in the world is not because evil exists or doesn't exist. I mean, it definitely exists, but only in things that should be good, that are good in their essence, but have been twisted, distorted, neglected, abused. And it's that people feel, and it's that people sense is having a hold on them, that it's so real that they can't escape it. They give it more power because of perception or because of the layers of abuse that they're not even fully aware of. And that's, on some level, a giving over of power, even if they're not fully conscious of it. And that's so hard.
And I think this kind of moves us a little bit into where I would say, many people are intellectually, because after kind of this section, we'll get into really just the heart of it, which is existential. But intellectually, somebody's gonna, and understandably so, reply to this with, okay, so God didn't make evil. Okay, fine, fair enough, but He allows it.
Right.
God is supposedly, He's all good, and He's all powerful, but it seems like we're now in a position, one would say, where either God is not all good or he's not all powerful.
Right.
Either God is all powerful and he allows evil to exist and is therefore not good, or he doesn't want the evil to exist, but he can't do anything about it, which would render him not all powerful. Right. So we should probably address this point next if there's nothing else to say about it.
So I did as one last very quick thing to interject, and I think that's a great place to go. This whole idea of evil being a bit unsubstantial, of just being a deprivation or a lack, and like John, you mentioned a shadow. I mean, in a sense, you could say shadows aren't real. They're just the spot the light didn't get to.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
But,
more like nightmares.
But in our life, we talk about...
Say that again. Shadows are not real.
There's the spot the light didn't get to.
Just the spot the light didn't get to.
Yeah.
Don't forget that.
It's worth thinking about.
Boom.
That's a takeaway for today's episode.
But we feel like suffering is super real. Okay, like things actually hurt. Let's just use a physical example for a moment. And so 2 things I just wanted to say on that really quickly is that pain is a result of a deprivation, like if you get your arm cut off. And I think, John, you know this. Maybe I've told you a story. I don't know if you know or not, Vince. When I was 16, I got run over by an 8-ton septic truck as a pedestrian, not like a car wreck. Caught underneath of it and pushed for some time across a parking lot.
This was in your first episode, wasn't it?
I think we did talk about that, actually, yeah. So I definitely experienced real, rather visceral pain. And then the doctor in the ER got called out of the ER and forgot to administer morphine, and I assumed that everybody knew what they were doing. So I went almost 4 hours without any kind of painkiller in the state, right? You know, bone sticking out, back fractured, road burn, all this kind of stuff. Very unpleasant. So that's really real. The pavement was real. The truck was real. My legs were real. The pain, the nerves firing away, all of this was incredibly real. And so something that I think is really important for us to understand here, the pain that we feel, there's a difference between our ability to feel it and what causes it. There's a rather rare... I don't even know the right word to use. I shouldn't call it a disease. It's not right. But it's kind of like a handicap or something. But it happens in a very small percentage of children. They're born without the capacity to feel pain. And they have a notoriously short lifespan, usually not more than a couple of years. Because it is almost impossible to guard them so sufficiently to keep them from doing serious injury to themselves. They will chew their fingers off, they'll burn themselves, cut themselves, all this kind of stuff, right? And they have no idea they're doing it because they don't feel pain.
Yeah.
So there's a need in our world, our natural world, to be protected. And so God has given us these nerve endings which can feel pain. So if I put my hand on the hot stove, I know to retract. There's actually nothing evil about the nerve ending. In fact, I would argue it's a positive good that God gave us this mechanism. And this is where we get confused, because people are going to say, well, but this evil feels so real. This suffering seems so real. So isn't evil, doesn't it have like some kind of ontological reality to it? Or didn't God make, the fact that I can feel suffering, didn't God make something that's actually evil? Look, the pain is not evil. Pain is actually a good response in our bodies. It's a very good thing. It's
just like anger is not evil.
Right.
But wrath is. It's different.
But the question is, what caused me the pain? Like if you punch me, John, which I hope you don't because you're taller and stronger than me, but if you did...
It depends on what you say next.
The fact that my nerve endings and body would react in a way to feel pain, their ability to do that is actually a positive good.
Yes.
The fact that you punched me, not so good. The fact that you triggered my nerve endings, not good, right? So that's where the evil comes into play. So I just thought that was good to clarify. Yeah. So we understand our ability to feel pain, our ability to feel sorrow, our ability to suffer, to be afraid, all of these things are actually very good things God has built into us. It's the things that cause us to have to use them. Those are the deprivations. Those are the, I didn't get to eat for a week, my stomach is complaining, right? Those are deprivations. I
think of the reality of funerals today and how Catholic funerals are so good. Yeah. So powerful. Yeah. Not because death is good, not because the grief feels good, but because Catholic funerals give families the proper means by which to grieve in a way that gives hope, healing, and peace.
I agree.
Beyond just annihilating them, scattering the ashes, and hoping that, or putting them in amulets or taking them home.
I don't think there's any approach to death that is more positive than a Catholic funeral.
It is so profound. Yeah. And I think of a couple of people who've died that I know recently. That one man died, a very good man, last week on a motorcycle. It was a terrible tragedy, and I just pray for him and his family. I can't even imagine, but he was 77 years old, so to go out on a motorcycle is pretty epic at that age, right? But yet at the same time, why did that happen? Why did God allow that, knowing that people in those that experience that kind of trauma, the family, if they have a good faith or they don't have a good faith, they can struggle with their faith. They can struggle to even believe in God or ever come back to church in those horrific moments, right? Or a friend of mine I went to grade school with was recently killed tragically, and it's so unexpected, so horrific. Why does God allow those types of things, like murder, for instance? Why would God allow that kind of evil to take place? And then how do we process it in a way that helps people not just cope with it, but to help it make actual sense? Say, no, if I hadn't gone through this suffering, if God hadn't allowed it, I don't know if I would have ever gained the passion or understanding or depth of purpose that I have because of it. Like someone who has an addiction then becomes a huge addiction recovery advocate because of that. And they help millions of others overcome it in ways no one else could have done, right?
Well, I think you just asked the two questions that are what the rest of the show about. First of all is, why does God allow this? And this is going to go right to your question, Vince, or why or how does he allow it? And then how do we respond to it? So let's, in which case, move to your question, which just kind of jog our memory. That was, God is supposed to be all good and all powerful, right? He's either not all good or he's not all powerful. This is the kind of the classic atheist argument, right? If he has allowed evil in the world. So how do we answer that?
Yeah, well, so I think, there are going to be, there's a few ways to approach it. Right. And this is kind of the story of this entire question of the problem of evil, is that you have the intellectual approach that may at least attempt to tackle the philosophical question. And then you have the existential approach, which is what really ultimately matters and speaks to our hearts. Right. And this is just as a minor tangent, this is kind of how it is with the rest of the faith. I see the philosophy of great figures like Thomas as this is how we, I guess, show or prove in many ways that the faith is not some irrational, silly bunch of beliefs that's just meant to make us feel better. That it actually, as you said earlier before the show, has philosophical teeth, and fundamentally, it's so that somebody who is looking at joining the church or is looking at coming into the faith, becoming a follower of Jesus Christ, they can look at the philosophy and say, okay, I don't have to check my intellect at the door.
Right.
Like I
have good reasons to accept this.
Faith and reason go hand in hand.
Right.
So that was the minor tangent. So I guess we should discuss the philosophical approach to that first, and then go into the second part of the show. And that would begin with the fact that God is only going to, in order for God to be both good and all powerful, it's not necessary for God to eliminate all evil. It's only necessary that God allow only evils that can be, the word we would use would be redeemed.
Right.
In other words, God only allows evils from which he can bring a greater good.
And that's Augustine, right? I think Thomas, in fact, quotes him in the Summa on this very argument. And I've said this before, but I find this very interesting. I've always loved how Thomas makes the opposing arguments in his writing so strong. He always looks for the best arguments. So fair, so intellectually fair. I love that. Instead of like trying to straw man, that's the term Matt Fradd always uses. He steel mans their arguments. But he proposes only 2 arguments against the existence of God. And as far as I can tell, they're still pretty much the only 2 that have ever been come up with. One is the naturalistic argument that the universe explains itself and is not in need of another explanation. And the other is the problem of evil. Except that Thomas frames it very close to how you did, in what is probably the strongest argument of evil I've ever come across, right? It's a very difficult syllogism that he proposes. But in his replies, he says exactly what you just said, but I think he's actually quoting Augustine, that God would not allow evil to exist were he not able to draw forth from it an even greater good.
Yes.
And that's the point, but it's not always easy to see.
Right.
So I guess my question back to you, Vince, would be, if I experience some sufferings in my life, and I'm thinking, okay, or let's imagine like paradise, like back in the Garden of Eden, okay, and then God allows the possibility, and focus on that word allow. We talk about God's will and God's permissive will. God has never actively willed evil, but his permissive will allows it to happen, knowing full well that he can still turn it around and make something even better out of it, right? I think a great example of this would be, me having children. And I tell my kids, don't do X, Y, and Z. But I need them to also grow and become mature and become responsible and learn certain things. I can't, so that kid wants to go and break the rule I just gave him. I can't just literally physically hold him on my lap all the time and say, you never get to move until you agree with me.
Right.
That's not a proper way to raise a child. That would be very damaging to that child. So I'm going to say, look, I warned you, but I will allow you to go and, stick your finger in the light socket or whatever, as long as it's not going to really hurt them.
Right.
I'm just trying to come up with an example.
Right.
But knowing that from that, should they choose that I allowed them to do, they will learn a lesson. They maybe will learn that maybe daddy's right once in a while. Maybe they'll gain some respect. Various goods can come out of that. So if we're in this paradisical situation and God allows the possibility of evil, what would be some of the goods that would come out of this? What could we could we gain from that? So
at the risk of being too theologically highfalutin, the example that I've been thinking of is like the prime example lately, which has been the fall in the garden, right? And so what happens in the garden? Well, Adam and Eve sin against God, and in so doing, bring sin into the world, and in so doing, bring death and suffering and destruction into the world, right? And death. I was just at a Theology of the Body crash course taught by John this weekend, and one of the things that really struck me, and I hope in another episode to get more into this idea, but that one of the notes I wrote down from the talk was that death is a cosmic obscenity. So we'll talk more about that, but it's like, death, which is, according to St. Paul, the wages of sin, this cosmic obscenity, which is really strong language to talk about something that many people assume is just a natural part of living, right? And then now think about the Easter Vigil, right? If anybody's been to an Easter Vigil Mass, what do we say? Oh, happy fault, that won for us so great, so glorious a Redeemer.
Oh, death, where is your sting?
Also, St. Augustine, that line is, so Felix culpa.
I, for a long time, have had trouble with the line, oh, happy fault. I'm like, I don't know what you mean. I look at Christ on the cross, and it's just,
doesn't seem happy.
Yeah. It's like, but oh, happy fault. But why? Because in our sin, in the supreme, like the primordial evil, right? God then brought about the Redeemer. He actually came into the flesh, the incarnation, the greatest event in human history. And in the incarnation, he allows even further evil. He allows himself to be killed in the most brutal way possible. And then he raises himself from the dead. And then there's the answer to everything.
Yeah.
The resurrection, the answer to literally everything.
But we get to see God's love in a way through the incarnation and the suffering that we wouldn't have otherwise. And this is very theologically dangerous ground, I might say. Like, it's great, but we have to be so careful because I think St. Paul says, should we sin more so that grace might abound even more? You know, and he's like, no, absolutely not. That's not the point.
Don't do that.
No,
Once sin has occurred, then we can also rejoice that God's grace was so great as to redeem.
And that God is so much bigger than it.
Yes.
Right? That we need not despair because God is bigger than all of it. And to kind of tie back in with the garden and complete that thought, and then we should discuss it, because I've actually not bounced it off anybody yet. So this is all live, you know. But
that's how this stuff works,
right? The in God becoming man, you know, human flesh, it becomes exalted.
Yes.
Human flesh becomes divine, which sounds blasphemous almost, but it's
well, that's a scandal of the
it's the
incarnation.
truth, right?
Yeah.
And so you had Adam and Eve in the garden who were just human flesh, right? I mean, they were human beings that had the body and soul, but
good, perfect flesh before the fall, but still not.
But when Christ raises from the dead, he's good and perfect. He's also glorified.
Yeah.
And he promises that in the general resurrection, when he comes again to establish his kingdom, and all of our souls return to our bodies will also be glorified like his is. And so, oh, happy fault. You know, somehow God turned this primordial evil of the fall of Adam and Eve into the glorious resurrection of the dead.
And I think it's so important to remember that what mankind has been seeking is a return to paradise. That's not what we got. We didn't get a return back to the state of Adam and Eve. We got something infinitely better.
Yeah.
It goes beyond what Adam and Eve had. And again, that is the sheer gratuitous magnanimousness of God. It's just like overwhelming. He's saying, okay, here's this evil. I'm not going to just like lessen it or even cancel it out or even do a little better. I'm going to go so far over the top that on the other side in the resurrection, it'll be like, you won't even remember a single tear. You know, like it's so much more.
Or
it's
if you do,
unspeakable.
you'll only remember it with joy.
Yeah.
You know, I think of Frodo and Sam and all the fellowship being reunited after the massive experience at Mount Doom and the overthrowing of Sauron in Lord of the Rings, right? That epic worldview of good conquering evil once and for all, but not as if evil is on some equal playing field as good, because, you know, Satan is not like on equal level versus God. It's not Satan versus God. I'd say it's more like Satan versus Saint Michael, the archangel, right? There's that level.
Yeah. Though even now he's way less than Michael because he's lost his gifts.
Correct.
You know, there's that deprivation. He has been deprived of the great gifts he was given God, deprived by himself. But I think to your point, that's what God is showing us. This is not an equal. It's not a canceling this out. It's not a, okay, things got bad, so I'm going to put you right back into the Garden of Eden where you won't have any pain and suffering, and you all get along, and it's going to be really lovely. That would be like a canceling out. God's like, no, I'm infinitely more than all this. You're going to actually get to participate in my own divine nature, become one with me, and experience the beatific vision and eternal bliss. Check that out. Yeah.
You know, and it's funny that we think of God's plan for us as like, okay, well, we had Garden of Eden and paradise, and then we had the fall. So God sent his son to redeem us. So I guess Jesus came because we sinned. to save us from our sins. Yes, he did come to save us from our sins, but he didn't come to earth and become one of us just because we sinned. It's not like God had plan A and then we screwed it up and he was like, oh shoot, didn't see that coming. Jesus, you go sort them out. Like it wasn't that kind of situation. Plan B. This is plan A. Despite our sin, regardless of our sin, even in the midst of our sin, God wanted to be with us, and he wanted to become one of us to serve us and to bring us to him, to exalt our flesh. It's like the grand condescension. If you go to Israel,
I was looking for that word earlier. Thank you. That's
what it
the one
is.
I wanted. Yeah.
And it's not condescending like, oh, you're so cute, whatever. It's more like entering into our mess, dysfunction, our pain, our sin.
Descending into is literally what it means.
Yes, and it's not just theoretical or even just theological, but it's incarnational. Think of it like if you go to Israel and you go to the Red Sea, or not Red Sea, but the Dead Sea, there's a huge sign there. And, the Dead Sea is just south of the Jordan River. The Jordan River flows, I think, out of it or into it. I can't remember which one. But the Jordan River is obviously a symbol of baptism and new life. It's the entrance of the Promised Land. The Sea of Galilee is teeming with fish. That's in northern Israel. Beautiful. The Dead Sea is almost stagnant, but yet when you enter in, you can be in the Dead Sea for a period of time. They don't let you stay in too long because the saturation of the salt and the minerals is so intense, it could be unhealthy. But when you come out of it, it is an amazing experience, especially when you have any of the minerals from the soil and the mud, and you're able to apply that to your skin. It is a profound experience. I say all this because that is the lowest point in the entire world. It is the lowest geographical location in the world. And as our guide, Christopher West, was actually explaining, it's almost like Christ descended into this part of the world, and on some level, he left his imprint. It's like the imprint of God, and it's the deepest, lowest, most intimate encounter he could possibly have with human beings in any physical location on this planet. And there it is, right there. And so in the same way, when we feel in our lowest place, in the most horrific suffering that we could ever experience in life, in a way where we feel like we've ruined our life or our life has no meaning, we want to kill ourselves, we're in the most violent kind of feeling about anything, God is there. God is physically present with us in the rooms where we are most wounded, most neglected. But we have to be able to open our heart, open our mind, and be open to conversion, which just is going beyond our mind, where we are now, to trust that he really is there, and we can find him there. And when we find him there, even if that abuse or suffering was 20 years ago and we're still dealing with the repercussions of it, can you go back there, allow him to show you where he was, to then bring comfort and healing and hope to you now? You can't change what happened, and you can't do anything about where you've been or what you've done. The one thing we can do is choose, where am I going to go from here?
I think that leads us very directly into how do we make sense of the suffering we experience existentially, right? Not just from the intellectual perspective. And I did want to say too, Vince, you're right. The redemption is the ultimate example of God bringing greater goodness out of evil. There's also lesser examples. Think of the virtues. We couldn't develop virtues without suffering.
That's right.
Courage cannot exist where there is no fear. Patience cannot exist where my patience has not been tried, So there are things, it's not to say that we should have ever wanted evil or sin to happen, but once they have happened, so great is God's grace that he's able to actually lead us through them in such a way where we develop virtues that we would have never had before. So there's always this idea of greater goodness coming out of the evil. Will this be a good place maybe to just take a short pause? Because I think we've looked at already some definitions of evil. Mm-hmm. We've looked at that great question of how can God be both all-powerful and all-good if evil still exists? Looked a little bit about the entry of evil into our world, to the Garden of Eden. But now I think we need to talk about how it impacts our lives on the very personal, existential level. So let's maybe take a short pause there and come back to that topic, if that sounds good.
Yeah, the last thing you said just jogged my thoughts on one point
Sure.
that I'd just like to shoehorn in here, which was the blind man in the gospel, who sinned, this man or his parents, and what's Christ's answer?
Neither, but so that the glory of God may be revealed.
Boom. Yeah. It's like, and the other thing is like, his blindness goes right back to your point, blindness in the eye. His blindness isn't evil. It's a deprivation. He shouldn't be blind. He should have perfect sight. And yet, if he had perfect sight from the beginning, when he encountered Christ, there would be no healing of his blindness. There would be no glorification of that blindness. And
Would
then
he have even wanted to encounter Christ?
He may not
have
have
been sitting aside the road saying, "Son of David, have mercy on me.
Right.
Come over here and help me."
Right. And then we never would even have heard of him.
Yeah.
And he would have just been another obscure dead person from a long time ago. I mean, it's
right. No, it's true.
Praise God that he opened himself up to that kind of healing.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, let's take a very short break, and we'll be right back in a moment with more about the problem of suffering and evil right here on Spirit and Spire.
Hey everyone, this week's episode is sponsored by Family Renewal Project. FRP is a local theology of the body apostolate in service to the Archdiocese of Louisville. They're dedicated to renewing the culture through the renewal of the family. They have so many amazing things going on, so check them out at familyrenewalproject.com.
All right, welcome back. So we've been talking about evil and suffering a little bit. We talked a little bit about some of the intellectual approaches to understanding evil and suffering and how a good God can allow suffering in the world. Plenty more there to talk about. We could go on for sufferings. Wow. For episodes, which
Isn't that pretty much how every episode goes, though?
Yeah.
we could make you suffer.
Exactly. It's going to induce suffering if we talk more about that. But yeah, we wanted to talk more now about the existential side, the lived reality. And I know, Vince, you've got some notes here and some things you wanted to talk about. The only thing I wanted to say at the beginning here is something that's very interesting to me is the book of Job. Because obviously the Bible is the revelation of God in written form. And if we're looking for sort of intellectual answers for our problems, theology and philosophy and all that, we say, hey, check it out. There's an entire book about suffering in the Bible. That's got to give me all the answers. And then we look at it and it's very, very strange because it does not go through the steps we've been outlining of, what is evil? It's a deprivation. I mean, all this stuff is true and good, but its approach is completely different, and it's a higher approach. The entire thing revolves around this great mystery of God basically saying to Job, who are you? And do you have any idea who I am? Right? He's basically emphasizing all of this is outside of, it's not contrary to understanding, but it's so far above Job's understanding. And then Job's response at the end of the book is, I think, the key. Because Job has always been a righteous man. Right? It's clear. He's a great model human being. Worships God, raised his family right, offer the appropriate sacrifices in the Old Testament. He's done all this stuff right.
So why'd all that terrible stuff happen?
Even says to the devil at the beginning of it, have you seen anybody like my servant Job? Isn't he awesome? I mean, God's like bragging on how great Job is. Can you imagine if God was bragging on you?
That's so cool.
Except please don't do it to the devil because I don't want to, get some backlash on that.
Right.
But, and so Job's been this really great person, and we were just talking about how God wouldn't allow evil unless he could bring a greater good out of it. So Job's righteous. Why does he have to suffer? His friends try to give him all the intellectual answers. They're trying to find the reasons. They say, you must have done something bad, Job. You must have upset God in some way. You must have failed. There must be some secret sin we don't know about. And Job's like, no, there's not. It's just not true. But at the end, Job says this to God. I had heard of you before with my ears, but now my eyes see you. That is answer enough. It's more than sufficient. If what we pass through in this life leads us, even if we don't understand it in the midst of it, but it leads us to see God, which is that not a reference to the beatific vision, to have that fuller relationship with God, to be finally perfected, to have our natures divinized, to enjoy that eternal happiness, then there's our answer. And so I love the book of Job from that perspective, because rather than trying to rationally explain the mystery of suffering, it shows us that God, who is beyond our comprehension and knows all things, is able to transform it even when we can't understand it to something that leads us to be able to see him face to face.
And I was listening to Father Mike Schmidt's Bible in a Year, and they start with a combination of Genesis and Job, reading simultaneously.
That's right, they do. Yeah.
And he said something that really struck me, is that by the end of the book, you usually are expecting, and this is why all these things happen to you. And that's not given to Job. There's no explanation of why did I allow such evil to take place in your life from God. God didn't give him an explanation. Even if we are called and invited by him to make sense of it and understand it and even verbalize the obvious effects that the suffering and the healing from suffering had in our lives, God's not the one making it obvious or clear, right? It's like, did God the Father come down and explain to the apostles why his son had to suffer and die? No. It was Christ who walked with the disciples in Emmaus and broke open the scriptures. And obviously, Christ is the Son of God, but there's still that mysterious, sovereign, seemingly unapproachable father figure that hasn't and won't explain every little thing. And I think of my own dad, who's told me in different times that there were things that happened in his life early on that he's not ever going to tell me, because it's not my business to know. Things he suffered or did and that shaped him on some level. And I want to know those things. But do I have a right to force him to tell me? I can't interrogate him. I mean, yeah, I'd hope he'd write some things down and share them with us. But even if he tried to do that, even if he tried to write down every little thing about what he went through, would I fully be able to grasp the depth of who my father is and why certain things happened in my life that maybe he was responsible for, good or bad, to give me a proper explanation? No. And God the Father knows that, and I think that's part of why he doesn't attempt to do it. He knows he doesn't need to, because can we fully understand the mind of God, even if he tried to present it? No. So he gives us Jesus Christ to give us the best possible, deepest explanation ever. But the point is, it's a mystery and not an unsolvable puzzle, but it's that mystery that goes so deep it will take an eternity to fully understand suffering and what suffering is and why it is allowed.
Yeah, well, and and also think about, the apostles trying to kind of grasp it a little bit, they wrestle with it, right?
Right.
And when Christ tells them, the Son of Man has to suffer greatly, and Peter says, "No, you don't have to do that. Like, don't put yourself through
and this
that."
is right after Jesus said to him, "You are Peter, and upon this rock
Yes.
I will build my church."
And what does Jesus say?
Get behind me, Satan.
Get behind me, Satan.
You're a rock, and now you're a stumbling block.
You're thinking as man thinks, not as God thinks.
Right.
Yeah. That is going to be the harshest rebuke ever. I was actually just thinking about that the other day. I was like,
could you imagine saying that to anyone?
Right. Yeah.
And it's not like one human insulting you. This is Jesus, right?
Yes. Yes.
And talk about getting a little humility after just being called the foundation rock of the church.
But you see, this is the perfect example, because Peter was meant to be the rock, but he was still struggling. He was still yet to deny our Lord.
He also
right?
had to suffer in order to be tried.
Right, and he had to suffer more and more and more just to prepare his heart for his own martyrdom. And even before that, he was trying to leave. And what was the vision that he had of Christ walking in the opposite direction? And he's like, Lord, where are you going? I'm going to be crucified again, because you obviously aren't willing to. And even in those moments, he wasn't willing. But what did he do? He followed the Lord in the end.
The key text is going to be, the just shall live by faith. And John, you were talking about how we can't understand these mysteries because they're beyond our comprehension. I think it is important that we understand that faith, this goes back to, you were talking about the correlation between faith and reason at the beginning. Many people misunderstand what faith is. Obviously, a lot of non-Christians misunderstand it, but I think a lot of times Christians misunderstand it. Faith is not something opposed to reason. It's not blindly closing your eyes and saying, well, this seems counter to reality, but I'm just going to believe it. But faith is a trust in a God who cannot fail, who does know more than we do. It is a real lived experience, but it supersedes the intellect. It goes beyond the understanding. In the midst of suffering, I will not be able to understand precisely why this suffering occurred, who precisely is behind every turn and corner of it, how exactly it may affect 2 people or 5 million throughout history. There is no way that my little human mind can possibly comprehend all of that. And so faith is essential to dealing with those moments, but I would also say not just to help us get through it, but faith is what makes us closer to God. And so when we are tested in suffering, if we have faith, that is when our faith grows. And so we actually end up coming out on the other side already having grown more by using the faith. And I think, and then I want to hear your thoughts, Vince, because I know you got some really great stuff here. So I'm going to kind of shut up after this. But I just cannot help but think of the 3 Hebrew children, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, being thrown in the fiery furnace. That's obviously a picture of great suffering, we would expect. And what's very interesting is we remember the story. The king looks and he says, oh, I see a 4th person in there, and they're walking around no longer tied up. And this fourth person, looks like a god to him. So this is obviously Christ, like a pre-seeing of the incarnation in some way. Lots of great stuff we can take out of this. But what I want to point out is what happens afterwards. The Bible tells us 2 things. Their bonds, because they've been tied up to be thrown in, so they wouldn't run away, I suppose. Their bonds have been burnt up, and there was not even the smell of smoke upon their clothes. So they enter the furnace, this picture of trial suffering. They do not actually come out unchanged. They don't get killed, they don't get destroyed, but they are not completely unchanged. Something did change. They were freed. The only thing that changed was that their bonds were burnt up. The fire of suffering designed to destroy them, A, didn't destroy them, B, actually got rid of the things that were tying them up and holding them back. But the only reason it was able to do those 2 things, to not destroy them, but to set them free, was because of the presence of that 4th person in the furnace with them, the presence of Christ. If Christ enters into our sufferings, or we let him enter in with us, then we will find that our sufferings will not destroy us, even if they feel like they're going to at certain moments. And they can feel like that. But in the end, they will set us free.
But only if we allow Christ to enter.
Only then.
Yeah. I love The Passion of the Christ, the film, the Mel Gibson film. It's just such a great film, and every time I watch it, there's more and more that you get out of it. That I'm just like, whoa. Maybe a good Lenten episode, but there's this idea of embracing our cross. And I mention that because there's one of the things that like sticks out to me about that film is after Jesus has been scourged and he's been given his cross to carry, and the way he holds it, it's an embrace. Jim Caviezel just does such a phenomenal job of portraying this embrace of the cross, and actually, it's to the point where the thief, not the good thief, Dismas, but the other one, begins his taunts there, not from the crucifixion site, but actually from the beginning of the road, and he says, "You fool! Why do you embrace your cross?" To our Lord, and that's such a, you might look at a Christian who embraces whatever cross they've been given, right? And that's just an incredibly deep idea that we could delve into more. But to your point, right? The fire burns the bonds because of that fourth person, and you embrace your cross because that's the means by which the Lord is choosing to save you. And you can't explain that in a philosophical treatise. You can't, you can sort of put it into words in some way, but it
can only be lived.
It has to be lived to be understood. And it's like only by embracing the cross do you understand it. And I say that as somebody who's gone into every cross, I think, kicking and screaming.
Same here.
It's like
too.
I won't go. It's like I won't go any other way. And
isn't that the very raw material God uses to bring about conversion in our lives? In fact, it's converts who've been through hell, literally, but kept going, that emerged on the other side with a zeal, a freedom, an understanding of this concept of why we suffer and how we redeem it that changes the world. Not people who've just always been Catholic and Christian and gone through the motions where they get stagnant or complacent or indifferent to deeper things. That's where I think we can get in danger in the church, where we don't teach the faith because we haven't lived it ourselves. It's not about just intellectual knowledge about Jesus. It's actually knowing Jesus, and knowing him is knowing him in the midst of our failures, our sins, our darkness, and letting him love us there, forgiving us there, so that we have hope and the capacity to love others and forgive them too.
While we may take our cross kicking and screaming, that's not maybe ideal, and we should pray for the grace, I'm sure, to do better. I know I still am always kicking and screaming every time, and I only am given very little tiny crosses, but they still annoy me.
Right.
But at the same time, as long as not fully rejecting them, it is some raw material that God will work with. And I just could not help but think of a vision that St. Maria Faustina has, which she records in the Divine Mercy diary, in which Jesus shows her three groups of people. They all have crosses. There's one group, and I think there was also a size difference in the groups. I think the first group was smaller, and they're all like nailed to their crosses, right? There's a second group that are not nailed to them, but they're holding fairly tightly onto their cross. And there's a third very large group that are just dragging their crosses behind them, and they all look really downcast. And Jesus says, "You see these, my daughter?" And she says, "Yes." And he says, "Insofar as you resemble me in my passion, so will you resemble me in my glory."
Oh. Gosh.
So the more we may fight the cross, we may be dragging it behind us loosely. Thank God at least that we haven't dropped it.
Right.
But God wants to call us into even more. If we can, by his grace, get to that point where we freely accept the cross, where we embrace it, then he's like, then you'll be that much more like me in glory.
Right.
And this, yes.
Well, it's just, just for whatever reason, so many of us have this idea that if I believe in Jesus and if I basically follow the rules and which isn't even what it's about, but this is the misunderstanding. If I do these things and if I if I'm a Christian and decently okay at it, then nothing bad will happen to me. I'll be fine. Jesus will protect me from bad things happening. And
it's the health and wealth doctrine.
Right. Yeah. The prosperity gospel. Yeah. And like, of course, that's a feeble faith, because then as soon as something bad happens, then what do you, wait, God must not love me, or God must not be real, or because the problem is never me,
or
right?
God
the problem
must be
is
punishing me, and I deserve
yes,
it.
But the problem is never me in my understanding. It's always outside. It's always God or somebody else.
Isn't that funny?
And right, it's funny how we work. And
or rather, don't work. Maybe that's a defecation.
But the Christian understanding of suffering is it's not about the elimination of suffering.
It's about the redemption of suffering.
It's about the redemption of suffering. It's just like, the Christian understanding of poverty is not that we ought to eliminate poverty. It's that we ought to love the poor. Mm-hmm. And similarly with the suffering, it's not that we ought to eliminate suffering. It's that
we should love
somehow
the person suffering.
Yes, and that's the being Christ-like, because somehow, in a way that we can't really understand, Christ says, "I will enter into your suffering." Yeah. Like, he doesn't say, "I'm going to take it away." In fact, he promises the opposite.
In this world, you will have trouble.
Yes.
Yeah.
But fear not, for I have conquered the world.
Yeah. And Jesus is the most faithful person, to God, he is God, that has ever existed. Look what he suffered. His 12 apostles, 11 of them were martyrs, and the 12th one was banished to a little island, right?
After being boiled in oil.
Yeah, I mean, details, Vince, details. Boiled in oil. Didn't kill him.
Yeah, he's fine.
Yeah. So, why should we ever think that if I live a good Christian life, I'm not going to suffer? And yet we all do this. I know you're not criticizing anybody who say that. I'm not either. I deal with this constantly, and I'm like a Catholic and understand that we're going to have suffering in our lives. And I still, frankly, get mad at God when things go wrong. I'm like, look, I'm trying. What are you doing to me? Why? And then, of course, even if it was a matter, to your point, John, of like punishment or judgment, this is a thought that I've had several times recently, and it's been fairly strong thought. I went through a very long period of my life living in a very unchristian way. And right now in my life, I have millions of faults. And probably from God's perspective, a lot of those faults are way worse than they may be from my perspective. But my point is, how short a time have I really even remotely been trying to follow God in my life? And I get annoyed when I get suffering. Now, that suffering is not about punishment necessarily, but even if it were, I've had this thought several times of thinking, oh my goodness, look back to the things I did and how much damage and pain and sin they caused in the world. I have not remotely in my life suffered remotely the equivalent of the evil that I put out in the world. Okay, so I got no room to talk about that. Even if it were just purely judgment or punishment, I have no reason to complain, though I don't think that's what it's all about.
Right.
But you mentioned redeeming the suffering, and I remember having this thought a long time ago. Buddha says something about, we have suffering because we have desires. And so there was this idea that you need to sort of slay the desires so you wouldn't suffer. Mm-hmm. And I think that often on the surface, two things can look very similar but be radically different underneath. We can look at the Buddhist monk, right? Very calm, very peaceful, lots of self-denial. We can look at the Christian monastic. They tend to be fairly peaceful and loving and kind, and they do lots of fasting and self-denial. So it's like, oh, well, what's the difference? They're completely the opposite. Because on the one side, there is this attempt to be lost in just like have no more suffering. Just kind of like become one with the universe.
We're
and
talking
all
about
of
nirvana, the absolute,
that kind of idea.
The ego death.
The denial
ego
of
suicide.
existence.
Yeah.
Yeah, total
Whereas
annihilation.
The monk, the Christian, the priest, the saint, does not stop feeling love and desire and all of these things but they actually use the suffering as an act of charity, right? It becomes a gift of self instead of just self-denial. So they're just radically opposite. You know, Christ is not on the cross saying, I'm going to try not to feel this. You know what I mean? Let's do some meditation here and see if the pain doesn't feel so bad. No. He's embracing 100% of that out of a sheer outpouring of love.
You know, when my brother was getting ready to get married, we went up to Chicago. No, it was my wedding, my bachelor party. My goodness, I can't believe it.
You do remember your wedding, right?
Yeah, I do remember my wedding very, very well. It was Chicago.
What day's your anniversary?
Yeah, October 5th.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Good.
Coming up on 4 years. Praise God.
Okay, Crystal can watch the episode now.
That's right. My brother took us up to Chicago and got us into a comedian on one of the nights, and the guy, he was kind of funny, I guess, but a lot of it was negative humor, sarcastic, and I didn't really connect. But there was one thing I really, really, really felt sorry for him for, and he just nailed why so many of us, myself included at times, have used different things to cope, whether it's things that people will fall to, can be alcohol or drugs or pornography or shopping or whatever. What is it? Why? And he was talking about, I drink, he said something like, I drink because it makes me not feel things. And I had one person say, well, I don't want to do that because I like to feel things. And he said, who wants to feel their feelings? And he said it in a joking way, but he said it in a way that revealed so much about the human heart.
Yeah.
And I wanted to weep for this man. It's like, that's in a nutshell is the exact reason people turn to things, because they don't want to feel their feelings. This is why people don't know how to pray and sit in silence, because the thoughts, the feelings that they're experiencing of all the traumas they've gone through, or the neglect, or whatever it is, the cognitive dissonance they maintain in their mind and heart, is preserved only by filling their life with noise and distraction. And so and one of those forms of noise and distraction is drinking and the bar hopping and all of the party nightlife kind of stuff. Not that you can't enjoy going to a bar or having a drink or going to a party, but when you fill your life with these things, sports can be another distraction. If you have a disordered attitude toward them, then suddenly your suffering becomes so numbed and stuffed that you never get used to suffering. But what are you doing but perpetuating your suffering, making your suffering worse, hurting people more? And Jeff Cavins said once that, if you get used to suffering through self-denial and picking up your cross, then by the time you're actually ready to die or on your deathbed, you're like, been there, done that, got the t-shirt, I'm ready.
We're all training for death.
We are. I mean, and not to be morbid, but to be realistic.
Well, because death is the entrance into life.
Yes. And those who try to avoid suffering or to eliminate suffering throughout their life actually increase their suffering by leaps and bounds, because they never learn how to. You see, Christ didn't suffer and die so that we wouldn't have to. Christ suffered and died so that we would know how to, because that's what redemptive suffering is. One of the most intense things, and I share this as a kind of a foretaste to what I believe will come whenever God calls me to share my fuller story, which I just feel, if he wants, will happen, sometime in his timing, right? I'm not even going to say soon, because I don't know what soon means. But just something that is near and dear to my heart is this story of a woman who went through just horrific suffering, and this was on May 12th, 1981. And her boyfriend beat her so much that her eyes swelled shut. I mean, it was just horrific, violent suffering. And eventually he, first, the next morning, she was watching the newsreels and found out that John Paul II had been shot. This was the day of his assassination attempt. And she could barely see the TV because she was just staring through slits because her eyes were so swollen. And she said clearly that, in that moment, she offered up her suffering for the survival of the Holy Father. And I mean, how many others were praying for him, right? But that, to me, that moment is the catalyst, the grace that flowed into her life that brought so much healing and hope and deliverance, even though he got her pregnant and, he tried to burn the house down with her baby, and her whole family inside. And her dad finally stood up for her and got him away. And that's what gave her the strength to vow in her heart, I won't even date another guy unless he's willing to put a ring on my finger and give her the respect she deserved. And guess who was on the police department who helped her out? And they came together because he was a longtime family friend. My dad.
Really?
That was my mom who went through that.
Wow.
That horrific suffering, the kind of suffering that makes you wonder what life is even about. Why did this happen to me? Why? People that go through even worse. Think of human sex trafficking. Think of children born into families that rape and abuse their children consistently and do things like this, And they have no concept of God. They have no concept of faith. They've never even heard these words or terms or phrases at all, other than used in curse words or butt of jokes or whatever, if that. And it's that kind of darkness that if they could understand the concept of redemptive suffering, it would change the world.
That has to be brought to a person.
But it has to be brought to them. They have to be shown it, taught it.
That is what Christ does for us, because Christ is the image of the Father, which means when we look at Christ in the incarnation, not just the words he taught, but everything he did, every step, every touch, every comment, every action was an action of God. Okay, we got to see God.
Yes.
And so we too, like the child you're describing, or the person that's never had a clue of all this, we too were blind to the realities of God. So he had to enter into our existence, into our situation, to reveal that to us. But we are then meant to also take that to others. And so the only way, I think, is that entering in, that compassion you were talking about earlier, Vince, or maybe this even before the episode, of suffering with, right? To that person that doesn't have an idea of God, maybe has never heard of God. That's what we have to then be through him. It's the extension of the incarnation through the church. The church is the body of Christ. We are his members, right? We are supposed to be Christ still present incarnate on earth. Now, we fail epically on the regular, but just like Christ came for us when we didn't have a clue who God was to show us that, so too that person who has maybe never heard of God or has suffered so much they have no idea of who God is, then we can't just tell them. We can't just say, here's a book.
Right, here's
a theology treatise. No. You have to get down there with compassion. You have to suffer with them. You have to be Christ suffering in the world right along beside them so they can see in your tears and your wounds and your nail marks, they can see what God looks like.
Yeah. Did you have a thought?
I have lots of thoughts.
John never has a thought.
What are you talking about?
That are coming through. This is why we started a podcast. But I have to say this with my thinking of my mom.
Yeah.
Because I've never thought of this until you said the idea of redemptive suffering, where it comes from. I think, how did my mom even think or know to do that? And I think of my grandfather, who was so faithful.
Yeah.
Always, he died praying a rosary. He was born in 1913, still remembered Fatima.
Offering it up's a very Catholic idea.
Yeah, and offering it up such a thing. So growing up Catholic gave her the sacraments, right? So she had her first communion. She had confirmation. This was right around when she was like 20, 21 years old. And it was almost like God has to take the initiative in our life. Yes, we can go through mindless, meaningless suffering from our perspective, but God's waiting for the right moment, the greatest breach in our hardened heart to pierce and enter in, the moment where we would be perhaps most open, most receptive, most vulnerable even. Yeah. And it's that moment that I believe was the day John Paul II was shot. I think for many throughout the world. I mean, think of the Holy Father entering into the suffering of humanity in the wake of the sexual revolution and all the horrific abuse that was taking place both in the church and throughout the world. And for him to participate in that suffering on such a visceral way, and then thank God and forgive the man who caused that suffering.
He was offering it up too.
He was offering it up for the whole world, which I believe was God's divine initiative in the hearts and minds of so many who witnessed his near death and yet his recovery and redemptive symbolic gesture of forgiveness toward his assassin. It's that I believe gave my mom the strength and ability to offer her suffering up that then brought redemption. How many others remember where they were? It's like when we were kids going through September 11th, we remember that, or whatever tragedy, Hurricane Katrina and so on and so forth. Those moments of suffering we remember forever. But we have to learn how to do something with that gives people hope.
You know, it's that God. It's so interesting, and this goes back to the blind man too, right? Would he have even sought Christ if he had not been suffering from blindness, or the woman with the hemorrhage? God enters our life through our wounds. And he asks us to enter his life through his wounds.
That is fantastic. I'm going to remember that.
Another takeaway from this episode.
Yeah, but no, that's.
But think about it. Think about it. First of all, look at the etymology of the word vulnerable, right? Vulnera in Latin.
I don't
wound.
know my Latin, unfortunately, but
I'm surprised.
Right.
a couple of words.
Right, just
Wound.
a few.
Okay.
Ubble can be, right?
Okay.
Able to be, right? Vulnerable, able to be wounded in a strictly etymological understanding.
So if I'm being vulnerable, I can't have my defenses up.
Correct.
I have to allow the possibility of being wounded. And if I'm going to allow the possibility, it might actually happen.
And what is a more vulnerable state than having, because you have able to be wounded, but what's an even more vulnerable state is someone who is wounded and bears their wounds in front of someone else. And is that not what Christ does after the resurrection in front of his apostles? He's in his glorified body. He literally has to walk through a wall to get into the locked upper room, all right? Because there's no other way in. But he's physical, right? You know? And he proves it by saying to Thomas, who doesn't believe, no, like, touch my wounds, touch my hands, my feet, and my side. And, you know, with that, think about that side wound, the most vulnerable wound of them all. Why? Because it was through that wound in his side, and it is through that wound in his side, that one has direct access to the heart of God.
Which would have been sealed off had it not been pierced by the lance.
Yes.
Yes. And so
God allows that. Sorry to interrupt, but we were saying about God's permissive will and his bringing good out of it. God allows Longinus to pierce his side because he knows that then all the world can enter into his heart.
Yes. Yes. And not only that, but out of the heart flows the blood and water.
Yeah.
You know, the blood which paid the price of our sin, which redeems us.
And enters into our own wounds, right? It reminds me of Psalm 139. Lord, you have probed me and you know me. You think of what a probe is. It's a medical instrument that doctors use to enter into the wounds of patients to bring healing, you know, like open heart surgery. I wouldn't hand a baby a probe and say, hey, have at it, you know. It's a trained professional who knows what they're doing. Christ is the greatest trained professional.
He's a divine physician.
Because he's the divine physician. And he probes our wounds. He enters in with his own wounds. The blood and water become, in some way, mystical probes that, provided we're open and receptive.
They permeate every aspect of our being to bring it healing.
Yes. And that's terrifying. That's difficult because we have so many defenses, and it's hard to be vulnerable.
And because of those wounds, we don't always trust God. We don't always trust that He has our best interests at heart. And
it hurts to get your wounds probed.
It does. Well, and so think about
a quote from the doctor. You sure you know what you're doing? That
right.
And yet, what does Christ ask St. Thomas to do? He says, put your fingers in my side. Like probe my side wound, right? And there's that great Caravaggio painting.
Oh, I was going to bring it up if you didn't.
Yeah, there's that great Caravaggio painting of that scene, of that event, where, Christ is like, yep, here you go.
No, he's not just that. He's like, here. He literally grabs his hand and says, shoves his finger in, like, do you see now? Do you believe? Like, here I am in all my woundedness.
And the thing about the wounds of Christ, even in his glorified body, first of all, there's a lot there, right?
Yeah.
Because in the glorified state of our bodies, the redeemed human flesh, there is no suffering. Mm-hmm. There is no defect. Right. There is no evil, right? Back to the question. There's no defect or evil in our bodies or in our souls for the saved.
So Christ's resurrected body must be perfect.
Exactly.
But it's got wounds.
And yet it's wounded. Right. And yet his perfect glorified body is wounded. And the interesting thing is that it's not scar tissue.
No.
It's not scar tissue. They're open wounds. But they're not, I don't know, they're not bleeding. They're not causing a problem.
Yeah.
They're not a problem. They've been redeemed. Yeah. And that is mystical beyond what any of us could hope to discuss in this podcast.
Walking through walls, right? And walking on water. The things he was doing before his death and then after shows that there's something beyond our capacity to fully understand.
I think what you're getting at, Vince, so is not only that power, but the fact that wounds have gone from suffering to no longer, the wounds of Christ at any rate, are no longer a suffering or even scar tissue, like you were saying, but they have actually been redeemed. The redemption is that they have been transformed into something that is no longer a defect. His wounds are actually a beauty. You know what I mean?
Yes.
His wounds are actually marks of glory. They are the channels of which grace comes to us. And so once again, he's taken that evil and turned it around. It's like God saying, go ahead, do your worst. I'll make it better in every single case. And I had one thought about this.
Yeah, and that's the difference between healing and redemption.
Yes.
That's the difference between healing and redemption. And Christ, not that healing's bad, Christ wants both.
Yeah.
For us. And the best we might ever be able to get on our own is healing. Kind of. I'm not even convinced that we would be able to heal from our own wounds fully on our own accord.
There's always a scar.
But redemption
is the fulfillment of healing. Like you heal in some level, both of physical, but also emotional and psychological and spiritual wounds. But redemption is what reconciles you with God and brings about a capacity for actual eternal life. Because no matter what, eventually your wounds will kill you.
Well, think about...
And that's it, unless there's something on the other side.
Let's be etymological again. What does the word redeem mean? It literally means to buy back, right? To repurchase. So we're by sin, under the dominion of the devil, right? Jesus buys us back. We don't think about this much anymore. This is very strong in the fathers of the church. They see that one of the actions of the cross as being this kind of like buying back. But think of a tool that's being used for the wrong purpose, right? And somebody comes along and says, no, that's not what that's meant for. I would like to buy that tool from you, and I'm going to show you what great things it can be used for. That's kind of the same thing. We have wounds, to your point, Vince, that are just negative. They're suffering, they're evil, they're pain. Jesus redeems them. He buys them back and says, watch me use these for goodness, beauty, glory, and the sharing of love. That it's transforming them into something beyond what we have ever thought they could be used for. And I just wanted to say this because you talked about the blood and water events and the pierced side of Christ.
Well, and I didn't even get to finish that thought, but
Please go ahead.
well,
Because I know we're probably getting a little low on time.
No, perhaps.
I don't want to interrupt this thought because it's great.
Okay, well, I'll just go because I don't want to interrupt your thought either.
I'll interrupt both of y'all.
I'm sure you will.
But that because I got to mention the blood, but I didn't mention the water.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
And the water. So divine mercy, right? The image of divine mercy and that devotion specifically tends to focus on the blood and water, right? I mean, that's in the Divine Mercy Chaplet, O blood and water, which gush forth from the heart of Jesus is a fount of mercy for us. I trust in you. That water, right? The fount of mercy, they're the waters of mercy. And what do we call the waters of mercy? Baptism.
Yeah.
Baptism. And our theology of baptism, we understand that when a person is baptized, every single sin that they ever committed up until that point is washed away. It's gone. And of course, you can only be baptized once. So confession is for those of us miserable sinners who continue to insist upon our way afterwards. But the point is that baptism it's the waters of mercy. It's that which, first of all, it's a sacrament that brings someone into the church. Right.
Entry.
You're right. You're not a Christian, properly speaking, if you're not baptized. And in that sacrament, we're completely forgiven. But that the waters, instead of being baptized by by the waters of the Jordan, let's say, it's the water from the side of Christ in many ways.
Yeah.
And so that is like, and the other thing about baptism that I was about to forget was we say that it's symbolic of our death with Christ so that we can rise with him to new
newness
glory.
Of life. Yeah.
Yes. And so, like literally from the dead body of Jesus, he's dead at this point. That's why they pierce him, to make sure he's dead. And it's the only wound that occurred to him after he died, too. From that flows the waters with which we are redeemed. And the very wound which poured that out is the access to the heart of God, is the access to his heart, which to this day is still wounded, just because the wound is still there, right?
Like a redeemed wound.
But it's a redeemed wound, yes. And also he still has his body. I mean, we tend to forget this, but he exists physically in a place with a body. He still has his toenails and hair follicles and whatever, but he's also got this wounded heart that beats. So
You're talking about right now.
Right now, right? Yes, as we speak, and
It's amazing to dwell upon.
And so and I often have found myself praying for a while now, like, Lord, give me your heart, give me a heart like yours. And I imagine it's that image of breaking our heart of stone and giving me a heart of flesh. But I don't want like my heart; I want His.
Right.
And I feel like He says to me back, well, my heart is pierced, right? Like,
like dangerous request.
Right.
That's not something that you just ask for lightly, or and so.
And remembering that every apostle was not there at the foot of the cross to even see that happen. So to make
John.
that request is right, except for the beloved disciple, John. And so to make that request is to make the request like John did, by being present at the crucifixion. Most people don't go all the way to Calvary.
If we want the
run
heart of
away at
Christ,
some
we
point.
have to live at the foot of the cross.
Right? And that is the ultimate journey of a Christian, to really experience that. And it's possible, right? Because at the end of the apostles' lives, even the ones who abandoned him, who's the only one who lived and died of a natural death? John. Not that they didn't try to kill him multiple times, but all the other apostles finally entered into their own Calvary at the end of their lives, even if they weren't ready for it when he first did it.
And in John 2, he spent the rest of the Blessed Mother's years with her. There's very special things about all of that.
Yes.
You mentioned, Vince, that this wound occurs after death, and the Church Fathers associate this because Christ is referred to as a second or new Adam, right? With the deep sleep of the first Adam, and it's from the deep sleep representing death from which his side is open and his bride is formed. And so Church Fathers see this, this is the death and passion of Christ. His side is opened, his bride, the church, is formed from the sacramental water and blood that flows forth from that. But I read something really amazing a couple of years ago, and I want to share this. Maybe it's going to kind of be a concluding thought as we wrap up. But Dr. Brant Petrie, I'm a big fan of. I know I mention him quite frequently on the show, and no, unfortunately, he doesn't pay me any kickbacks for mentioning him. But he points out something really, really interesting. The Gospel of John is two things. Jesus is very clear, or the Gospel of John is very clear, that Jesus' body is the temple, the new temple. Because Jesus says, destroy this temple in 3 days, I'll raise it up. And John inserts, he was talking about his body. Okay. So in some way, the body of Christ is the temple. And we know that the Old Testament temple, like the tabernacle, was made on the pattern of heavenly things which Moses saw on the mountain. So it is a pattern of Christ's body. At the cross, blood and water pour forth from his side after he's pierced. And John says he draws this sudden attention to it. He says, the one who is writing this is the one who witnessed it. His witness, his testimony is true. Like, he really wants to emphasize this point. And Brant Petrie is like, why? Why is he drawing so much attention to this? And he points out that, and I was unaware of this, but the location, Jerusalem for the Passover, when pilgrims, the thousands of pilgrims throughout the year, they'd be coming up for the Passover, they'd go up the Kidron Valley, and the lambs would be being sacrificed. There were so many sacrifices that the blood could not be held. So they had to build an aqueduct sort of thing underneath of the temple to let the blood run out into the Kidron Valley, where it mingled with the waters of the Kidron River. So if you were walking towards the temple at Passover, you would see blood and water mingled, flowing forth from the side of the temple.
Wow.
But as amazing as that is, what he goes on to point out is that means that Christ's body is the temple, we see the blood and water flowing forth from the side, trace it back, that means that the altar is his sacred heart. And this goes back to everything we said about offering it up, right? What do you do on an altar but offer things? You offer sacrifices.
The very gifts that are offered
Except
become
they
the
have
body
to be
and blood.
offered out of love. In the Old Testament, it was so often out of duty. But Christ has now showed us that the altar is his heart which speaks of love, is we offer these things up out of love, and then they are redeemed.
Yeah.
And that's not an intellectual, cold, removed kind of
No, it's
take.
a lived experience. You have to live it to understand these deep things. And if you aren't open to that vulnerable experience of conversion and redemption, then these words are foreign. They sound unfamiliar because you haven't passed through that journey. We're talking about a relationship with a person, relationship with Jesus. We know him as a human being, but also of the God who saved us from ourselves. And the greatest gift he gave us was the best version of ourselves. After obviously himself, right? And there's some kind of theological argument that the very best version of ourselves is himself.
Yeah, in a sense.
In a sense, right? And so there's some beautiful marriage that we're called to enter into.
And I think what we've picked up from this is taking what you were just saying, Vince, and what you just said, John, and the idea of the fiery furnace of suffering in our lives. The key to it is not just intellectual understanding, not even just trying to offer it up, as good as that is. The key is allowing Christ to enter into the furnace with us, to enter into the suffering with us. It is to let Christ into the wounds. Suffering will destroy us if we don't. It will not have redemptive power. It will have only destructive power. The only way to make sense of suffering is to let Jesus into our wounds, to let him come and have compassion, to let him sit beside us, to let him, and to enter into his suffering. Take my yoke upon you, right? To be joined with him.
Because if we don't let him in, then we aren't even capable of offering things up with our heart, through our will, and we're not even capable of understanding what any of it means to begin with on even an intellectual level.
So I would say to anyone out there experiencing sufferings that they cannot make sense of, this, and I think we've talked enough that this is very clear. This is not some trite line at this point. This is a very real, this is very much a reality. Is the only solution is to say to Jesus, please come and enter into this with me. That's really the only answer. We will never make sense of suffering otherwise.
It's
It's a mystery.
It is, and it goes right back to Job, right? Because especially considering the discussion that we just had about Christ on the cross and the temple of his body and the blood and water and all of that. Again, the point of Job, it's not, this is why these bad things happen. It's, who are you and who am I, right? And we look at God. We look at God and we say, who are you? And I mean, it's, love.
And if you want to find out, come to Calvary.
Right. And it's yeah. and it's like, who am I?
Oh, my Lord.
The one that God loves. The one, it's probably a cliche at this point, maybe, I don't know. But, the idea that Christ on the cross is saying, I love you this much. It's that tells us everything we need to know about who we are and who he is. And that is, the answer to suffering is not one that you could simply just write in a treatise or explain in a simple conversation. It's Christ entering into our life through our wounds. If we let him, if we ask him to, he will. And we have to know that his, if you're burdened, that's what he says, come to me, all you who are burdened, and you will find rest.
Can I say this in closing? Because you said, who am I? That is a question of identity. It's not just, what do I do? Or what do I look like? But who am I? And you said the answer to that was the one who is loved. That is actually our identity. And you just made me realize that. Think about the fact that we obviously did nothing to bring ourselves into existence. The fact that we exist, that we have being, and this takes us all the way back to the beginning, is a sheer act of love on God's part. So therefore, our very existence, who we are, what we are, that we are, is the one who is loved. You're absolutely right. I just never seen it that way before. God is the giver of gifts. Our very existence is the receiving of a gift, the very gift of life itself. So that is who you are. You and me, each and every one of us, no matter what we may be experiencing, we are the one who is loved. That is our identity.
My final thought is just the recognition that so many who may listen to this podcast episode may be suffering in some impossibly unfair way that makes them feel maybe every word that we say, piercing them like a lance. Mm-hmm. And just the recognition that God sees them. Mm-hmm. He sees them and he hears them.
They are loved.
And that he knows them and he loves them and that they are lovable. Every single person is lovable. And if we can get beyond the lie that we are unlovable, or if people really knew me, they couldn't accept me for who I am or for what I've done. But their deepest identity is that they are lovable. And the deepest purpose is that they are capable of loving.
Yeah, you're right. The deepest identity is that you're lovable, apparently, because God, who is perfectly love, made you and made your identity. So, and it goes back to what we said about the devil even. Can't be all completely 100% bad, you know? And that really is one of the most ultimate lies, is to believe that one is hopeless. Can't be, because God made you, and therefore all that he has made, he declared good. We may do bad things, but you are not hopeless. No one is.
And so we pray for all those who are suffering, those who've lost loved ones tragically, the few I've mentioned today, and those who've endured hardships. And we thank you all for your all's time today.
And we will keep you all in our prayers as well. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us today for this conversation. It's been a little bit long, but hopefully it did not cause any undue suffering on your part. But seriously, we do pray for every person that is listening. And if you are experiencing any suffering, any pain in your life, we will pray for you. But most of all, let Jesus himself in to walk with you. Let him into those wounds. Let his blood enter in and permeate every part of you. And I think it's St. Paul that says that I am persuaded the sufferings of this life are nothing, no matter how great they seem, are nothing compared to the glory which is yet to be revealed. On the other side, we will say that no matter how bad this was, it was nothing compared to the awesomeness that God has given us through that suffering. So thank you all for tuning in, as always, and we will see you all next week right here on Spirit Inspire. God bless.